Masha.
Upton Ambush. So
I don't know.
there's no meaning ish.
How do we were able to keep going there?
Great job.
Tá fáilte rud Chéad ina bhfuil tú. Tá míad ar eis arís in ige Comóradh an Chéad ar Luíochán Bhliain. Seo craobh scaoile ar ceann Coiste Comóradh Bhliain agus Comóradh. This is a broadcast on behalf of the Kilmichael and Crossbarry Commemoration Committee to mark the centenary of the Upton Ambush on the 15th of February 1921, in which 3 volunteers and 6 civilians lost their lives and several more were wounded. Is mission donna cá sé cá héarlach an Coiste Comóradh. I má haunta a ríis tá Seán Ó Céalacha mac le Tom Kelleher a trid ag Luíochán Upton agus in íg sin ag cá Comóradh mar Canara Ran Óga. In my company also is Seán Ó Céalacha, son of Tom Kelleher, who fought in the Upton Ambush and over a month later also fought at the Crossbarry as a section commander. In my haunta freshen, tá Bertra Harrica mort agus Micheál O'Sullivan. Fura Uncle Bosch, Patrick O'Sullivan, ag trid son a Saoirse ag Luíochán Upton. In my company also our brothers Mort and Micheál O'Sullivan. Their uncle Patrick O'Sullivan was one of 3 volunteers who gave his life fighting for Ireland in the Upton Ambush. Just a small bit about the background at the time. In West Cork, the War of Independence was Bhliain Cheol in full flight. The flying column had major successes at Turin and Kilmichael a few months earlier in 1920. Bhí gaisce déantacha. The month of February 1921 was a particularly difficult time for the West Cork IRA 3rd Cork Brigade. They lost 11 volunteers in the space of 12 days, including Upton and Crushnaland of Kilbrittain, where 4 volunteers were surprised trenching a road. I will now move on to my guests here tonight. I will go to Mort first, and Mort might give me the background to the Upton Ambush, to the planning of it, and to the people that were involved, in particularly from the Crosspound Company area. Right, Mort?
Yes, certainly. Information had come to Charlie Hurley, the commanding officer of the 3rd Cork Brigade, and he was staying in O'Mahony's of Belrose at the time in the Crossbound Company area. Information came to him that a party of British soldiers, something about 14 or 15, would travel on a morning train from Cork towards Bandon and further on indeed on that morning, and there'd be about 13 to 15 soldiers on it. Now this proved to be true information and good information. So with that in mind, they usually had very good sources of information. With that in mind, he decided that they should attack this body of British soldiers. There were a number of reasons for it. Of course, there was a war on. They were looking for their freedom. They were fighting for it. As well as that, they needed arms and ammunition. You can't have an army, including a volunteer army, without arms and ammunition. And those were very, very scarce indeed. So the British soldiers would be armed, obviously, and they'd have plenty of ammunition with them as well. So they were a very inviting target. There was another consideration, however, and that was that the British were using passenger trains to carry troops, which was probably chancy enough under the then rules of war, the Hague Conventions as they were called at the time. But anyway, it was they wanted to teach them a lesson that they couldn't do it. Now the railway men had objected to this, but eventually, and they refused to move trains and things before that, but they were cowed down and beaten down by the end of 1920 because they'd lose their jobs if they didn't move the trains, even with the British on them. So now they needed to be taught a lesson to stop them doing that. And that really was the background to the Upton ambush. He decided that he would use, as the 3rd Brigade Flying Column were engaged further west in the county, he would use the officers of the brigade and battalion that were present in the area with the ordinary members of the crossbound company. And that is what he did. And considering that they would have the advantage of surprise, he figured that 13 volunteers would be enough to do it. Now, it is important to understand, because it can sometimes come up, that the idea of British using passenger trains to move troops was probably very, very chancy, and basically it was morally reprehensible because they were exposing ordinary civilians to danger by doing that. But up to this point, they had always travelled in the one area in the train, the one compartment or compartments. On this occasion, this happened too. The party from Cork did that. But something else happened. There were extra troops came on board. Extra troops came on board at the Chéad, the previous station to Upton. They came on board there because obviously I think it's likely and almost certain, morally certain, the British had known already that there was a planned ambush. So there were new troops came in at the last moment, if you like, at the last station, Kinsale Junction or Chéad, and they were the Essex that came from Kinsale, and they joined in. Now there were a number of precautions that the IRA had. One was that when the train would leave Cork, one of the local men from Ballymurphy, John O'Connell, he would contact the station when the IRA had taken it over. He would contact the station and give the exact location of the train, which would make the British vulnerable and indeed the passengers pretty safe as well. So that did happen, and they knew where they were, so they were quite happy. But to make sure they had 2 scouts at the previous station to confirm that, if you like. And because it was a junction, Kinsale Junction, there was usually a long stop there. I'm not sure what purposes, for coaling or watering the engines or setting up passengers and so on. But on this occasion, an odd thing happened. There was plenty of time normally for fast cyclists to carry the message from Chéad to Upton before the British would come. And as it happened, there were now a whole lot of extra British troops on the station in Chéad, and they were obviously going to board the train, which they did. And the scout made off as fast as he could, but he was late in reaching Upton. If he had reached in time, to would probably have been called off on that occasion. So that, but as well as using the passenger train, now the new troops sat in amongst the ordinary men, women, and children on the train, which was very morally reprehensible indeed, because they were exposing these to great danger without any reason for it. And as well, we know that, for instance, the O'Leary children who are going to abandon the school on the train told that they were near a British soldier who was kind to them, but he shouldn't have been mixed up surely with the ordinary people. Mind you, afterwards the British denied that they had mixed with the ordinary people there, but that was a lie, and there's plenty of evidence of it.
What kind of numbers extra British troops joined the train?
The original numbers are going to were, as expected, about 15 from Cork, but there was 35 or more from Kinsale at this stage. So that would be 50-ish or more
50 or
at this
more, yeah.
stage. So it would undoubtedly have been called off if they knew that, if the news got to Charlie Hurley in time, but it didn't. But I think I'll now hand over to Michael, and
So-
he'll talk more about the
Michael, so
the
Mike, there
ambushes.
was there was a fair bit of confusion. So when the train came into the station, Upton station,
Yeah.
there, obviously because the soldiers were mixed in the carriages.
Yeah. You see, normally the train would remain at the Kinsale Junction, which is another name for Chéad, for about 30 minutes, which was a long time. So it could take a scout 14 or 15 minutes to cycle from Chéad to Upton. They had their homework done. You obviously had to do your homework for an operation like this. So when the train came in, as advised by John O'Connell, the soldiers from Cork were sitting together in the compartment, but there was 35 soldiers from Kinsale, and they boarded the train, and as Mark said, they dispersed amongst the passengers. And now, straight away, the scouts got on their bikes, because these were there was far more British soldiers, and the dispersal amongst the passengers created a great danger. So they raced to Upton, but they had a further surprise and a bad shock. They heard the train taking off after 15 minutes instead of 30. So unfortunately, the train arrived before the scouts. Now, if the scouts had arrived, Charlie Hurley would certainly have called off the ambush. He could not or would not endanger civilians.
Yes.
And he'd also know that he was completely outnumbered. He had, as it happened, 14 men. There was one volunteer came on his own late, so there was 14. He couldn't take on 50 British soldiers with 14, but so he didn't know anything about this. There was 11 volunteers from the local company from Crossbound, and Charlie Hurley was the OC of the West Cork Brigade. He was in charge. Flood Begley was from Bandon, who became famous a month later as the Piper of Crossbarry. He was also an officer of the West Cork Brigade. And then you had Sean Phelan from Liverpool, who was there as well. The remainder then were Crossbound Company members. I can give you their names if you wish.
Yeah, you can if you would.
There was,
Tom Keller would have been one of them, wouldn't he? Tom Keller.
yeah, I tell you now. Yeah, we'll kind of go around the way they were. There was a Jack Hartnett from Killian's. He was on the Bandon side of the station house. Then at the layout today, funnily enough, is more or less precisely the same as it was 100 years ago, with one exception. At that time in 1921, there was a pedestrian overbridge, and that is now gone. And Charlie Hurley perched himself on the overbridge so that he'd have a good overview of the whole thing. Now, Paddy Leary of Ballyhandle was at one side of the foot of the overbridge. He's of course a grandfather to Carmel O'Mahony and to Tony and Brian McCarthy of Ballyhandle and all the McCarthys. Then on the corner of the road at the time, there was a right angle bend on the road. It has been realigned since, but at the corner there was Tom Kelleher, Sean's father from Crowhill, and Din Doolan of Crossbarry. as you mentioned already, Tom was a very eminent volunteer in the West Cork Brigade. At the corner of the railway, probably near the public house, was Dan O'Mahony, a member of O'Mahony family from Belrose House. Upstairs, inside the window of the public house of the gable, was petticoat of Lisiniski. Then in front of a little terrace of houses running back from the pub, and one was the post office, and in front of that was Dinny Desmond of Ballyhandle. Then you had inside of that you had John Butler of Barna. John Butler, of course, would be an uncle to Mrs. Mary Jo Duggan of Barna and her sister, Mrs. Lorden. In the goods store, you had Bat Farry of Ballymurphy, who was a cousin now of Mrs. Spillett of Belrose. And you had a neighbour of his, Neil Begley of Ballymurphy as well. And then in the corner of the station house, our uncle Pat O'Sullivan was there. And within the ticket office of the station house was Flor Begley and Sean Phelan. Now, when the train approached, Charlie Holly.
Michael, just a minute. For people who mightn't know, where there'll be a lot of people listening to this now from all over the world, Upton is between, is kind of between Crossbarry and Inishannon. Is it, just, you might tell me where exactly Upton is?
Yeah, Upton is about a mile from Crossbarry, and I suppose maybe 2 miles from north of Inishannon, you know.
And from Bandon then to be about 6 miles.
Tis about 5 miles from Bandon, I suppose, you know.
Yeah. So that's okay.
Yeah.
Carry on.
So it was on the railway line at that stage. As we know, the railway line was closed in 1961. Like, but when the train approached, Charlie Holly gave the signal to start. There was a very, very intensive gun battle for, I suppose, 15 minutes or so, unfortunately with a lot of casualties. And Tom Kelleher wrote a very good account of the Upton ambush on the Kerryman. And I think it was done on 2 occasions, but it was certainly done in October 1967, on the 7th of October, and on the following week's edition on the 14th of October 1967. And he was talking about Upton, and he said that the gun battle at Upton was undoubtedly the toughest I experienced during my service with the 3rd West Cork Brigade in any period. And he went on to say that Upton was a more severe test and provided experience which was put to great use at Crossbarry a little over a month later.
So there was two volunteers killed early on. So Bat Falvey and Sean Whelan were killed.
That's right. I want to say first that the very sad part with it that there were 6 civilians killed.
Yeah.
And there was also 2 railwaymen killed, including a local young lad by the name of Sisk. And he had been working in the railway in Cork, and he had finished his night shift and he came home, but unfortunately he was killed. Of the volunteers, there was 2 killed outright. Sean Phelan from Liverpool, who was in the ticket office, he was killed. And so was Bat Farry of Ballymurphy. He was in the goods store. And Pat O'Sullivan was mortally wounded. But I suppose miraculously or something like that, he managed to pull himself almost a mile to a safe house of Cronins of Clash and Imod. where he got you know, some treatment, and from there he was taken to Dub to Dr. O'Sullivan, who treated the volunteers, and eventually he was taken into the North Infirmary by in fact Jack Kennefic, and he died 2 days later on the 17th of February.
If he had been treated, if he had been treated earlier on, I suppose his life might have been saved if he had got treatment.
My father was told. My father was told that if he was treated earlier on, they could have saved his life, but there was 2 days. There was the time lapse was too great.
Yeah.
No.
It was very hard. It was very hard. Michael, it was very hard for the volunteers to target the British soldiers when they were mixed through the civilians in the train on the train. It must have been very difficult for the IRA to target when they were mixed.
Oh yes, you see, the problem was that they had been dispersed next to the passengers, you know, which is obviously essentially what they were doing were making hostages of the passengers. That's what they were doing, you know.
But at that time, the British were claiming that it wasn't a war. They didn't recognize it as being a war situation. That they were describing it as a criminal conspiracy. That they weren't recognizing them as, you know, as a legitimate army. But Tom Barry said that Tom Barry did say after Kilmichael that they recognized them as a legitimate army because they brought in martial law after Kilmichael.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, Dan O'Mahony was very, very seriously injured, and he died about 2 or 3 years later. Jack Hartnett was badly injured, and as far as I know, spent the rest of his life in hospital. And of course, Charlie Hurley himself was injured, and Sean probably tell you about the heroic rescue of Charlie Hurley, the long distance from Upton to the safe house of Patsy Sheehan in Kilmore.
Yeah. I might bring Sean in here, so Michael, I might bring Sean in here about in the aftermath of the ambush, or you can talk about the actual ambush as well. About the withdrawal. The withdrawal was fairly hectic, and they were under heavy fire withdrawing from Upton because when they realised that the British had they were outnumbered by 5 to 1 early. So they were under big pressure. Like, so, Sean, you might go through the withdrawal
Could I say in the beginning, before I come to that, and could I say in the beginning why it took place at all in the first place?
Yeah.
And it goes back to the general election of 1918, and Sinn Féin had a major victory there, 73 seats. And then the first Dáil was set up in 1919 in the round room of the Mansion House in Dublin. But the British didn't recognise it. It was disastrous from that point of view. Even at the peace conference, Sean T. O'Kelly led the Irish delegation to the peace conference in Paris. They didn't even get a hearing at it. So the British were telling the world that this was an internal problem. This was a policing problem. If we can sort out these wild Irish, well, then everything will be back to normal again. This is a policing problem. And of course, it was far from it. They ignored. Not only did they hinder the work of the first Dáil, but later on, I think it was in September of 1920, they declared it illegal and all that sort of thing. So it was. I must say, first of all, that I'm very impressed with what Martin and Michael have said. They have shown tremendous knowledge of Upton and what happened there and all that. Tremendous knowledge. I was very, very impressed with it. So that's the background to it. If the British had recognised the first Dáil, well, then there would have been no need probably for a war of independence. They'd have sat down around the table and sorted it out and give us our independence, because we had voted for independence. They didn't give it. So they went on to give the impression that, oh, this is a policing problem and all that, and they brought in the black and tans and the auxiliaries and all that.
Yeah, unfortunately, colonial masters don't operate that way. Yeah. They don't recognize democratic mandates across the world. Every country in the world that has removed imperialists have had to fight for their freedom. Like, so, the British are not the British are no different. Like, so.
No.
So you might just go through the.
As Mort said, Upton took place in the middle of the War of Independence. Kilmichael had taken place on the previous November and all that, so it was in full flow. The War of Independence full flow. But yes, you're quite right. If Charlie Hurley had known that that there were more British on board and all that, he certainly wouldn't have gone ahead with it. But you're quite right. You mentioned about Tom Kelleher very rightly there, Michael. Yeah, it was. He always said that. He always said it was of all the engagements that he took part in, Upton was the toughest. In fact, I'll just give you one little story on that one. It came down to hand-to-hand fighting in Upton between Tom Kelleher and many of them. He was in one side of a wall, just entering at the entrance to the goods yard. Tom Kelleher and Din Doolan were there, and there was a problem that at one stage Din Doolan's gun wasn't working, and at one stage that the British soldier on the other side of the wall stood up, and he was going to shoot Tom Kelleher, and Kelleher put the gun up, and then at one stage Kelleher had he had a problem. He had no ammunition in his gun. The British soldier was about to shoot him, so he let on that he was he let on that he was going to pull the trigger. The British soldier went down. He went down to the bottom of the wall on the other side. While he was down, Kelleher was able to reload, and that saved him. That saved. That went on for a while. And it became obvious then. It became obvious then. Charlie Hurley was on the bridge. Charlie was shot fairly early on, and he didn't recognize it. He got a bullet in the face and came out one side and out the other. He wasn't aware that he was shot. It was a fierce engagement. It was a fierce engagement. I suppose it resembled Kilmichael in some ways, in some respects.
Before you continue there, Sean, you might just sit in a small bit to the computer.
Oh, sorry, I'll sit in a bit.
Yeah, so we can see your face. Sorry about that. Sorry for interrupting you, Sean.
But they had, even though that they lost men in Upton, and unfortunately there were civilians killed, and somebody mentioned the three O'Leary children, and one of those three O'Leary children was Donald, and Donald was a teacher of Martin, Michael and myself in Grants National School. A good few years ago now, I won't say how long ago, a good few years ago now, he was teaching us. I spoke to Una the other day, and he had two sisters. His two sisters were with him. They were the three O'Leary children on the train as well. So it was a very dangerous situation. By the way, too, the British had learned from an ambush that was held at Trishan Beg on the Mallow, on the Tralee line shortly before that. And the local volunteers in North Cork that was successful. One British soldier was killed, a number of them were injured, and they captured ammunition and guns and all that at Trishan Beg at that ambush. Now, it was hoped that the same would happen at Upton, but the British got wise to that because they always travelled in one carriage. But on this occasion, they were, as Michael said, they were interspersed, they were mixed up with the passengers, and that made it very difficult. They had learned from that. And that was very difficult as well, as you suggested, Danica, for the Irish to do it. But they were even though that they lost men, they were very, very lucky that they didn't lose more, because when Charlie Hurley called it off, then he said to Tom Kelleher, he realized then that I'm shot. I'm shot, Tom. I have a gunshot wound, Tom said. Tom Kelleher said, yes, you have. And then they were trying to get off, and he jumped off a fence, and in jumping off the fence, he sprained his ankle, and he couldn't walk. So here was Charlie Hurley, the leader of the column, if you like, of the ambush party. He had a bullet wound, and he couldn't also walk. So Tom Keller had to take him on his back out of the thing under fire for a while. And they reached O'Mahony's gates to the west of it. But they also kept the British at bay a bit as well, and got the chance of as Michael said, that his uncle was very fortunate to be able to scramble to safety. I think Dan O'Mahony was fairly badly injured as well. He was rescued as well by Dindoolan and so on. So eventually they got out of Upton and good. But I must tell you, Charlie Hurley was a very brave man. He said to Tom Kelleher, somewhere beyond O'Mahony's gates and further west when they were in the fields, he said, "You make your way now, Tom." He said, "You make your escape and I'll paddle my own canoe." So Tom Keller said, "No, I'm not going to desert you. I'm not going to leave you at this stage." And they went on, and they went to Patsy Sheehan's, and they were also, I think, in Doyle's, Nurse Doyle, Jim Doyle's sister was a nurse and all that.
How far, Sean, if I can quite crash it there, how far would they have to travel into the safe house, the Doyles, or how far would that be from?
They had to travel a few miles, a good few miles to get to Patsy Sheehan's and Kilmore.
So 4 or 5 miles, was it?
They had about 4 or 5 miles, yes.
At this stage,
they went further on.
At this stage, Sean, so all the flying column were scattered. They were gone away. They were after going away in groups of. Charlie was with Tom Keller.
They were.
The others had probably had dispersed.
Even though there were casualties, and of course there were casualties, and they had two killed, and it was Pat O'Sullivan died very shortly afterwards. Even though they had 3 casualties and there were civilians killed and a couple of railway people killed and all that, it could have been a lot worse. It could have been a lot worse. But the other thing about it, I suppose, it was an attempt. It was an attempt to keep the War of Independence going. It is significant from that point of view. They wanted to show, I suppose, the British that they were still in business, that the British weren't going to have it all their own way, because they had been traveling on that line regularly, based in one carriage, of course, seated in one carriage. And they wanted to show them. And then, of course, the other thing I would say, of course, is that it was great. It was a baptism of fire. The volunteers who took part in the Upton Ambush, it was a baptism of fire for them.
Yeah.
But it stood to them at Crossbarry. I mean, for example, Flor Begley was the piper at Crossbarry, as Michael said. Tom Keller was in charge of the section in the Castle Field. Yeah. He wasn't put there by chance. There was reason for putting him in the Castle Field, because he was well away from the main section. The main sections were on the road. But Charlie Hurley, Barry knew from Charlie Hurley that Keller had proved his worth in Upton. So he was put in the Castle Field so that he would protect the rear of the column and all that. But I'm very lucky to be here tonight. I'm very lucky to be here tonight.
Was there, Sean, if I could quite crash it there, was there also a few more who fought at Crossbarry? You had Tom Kelleher and Flor Begley. Who else would have fought at Crossbarry?
Yes. Well, you had Flor Begley was the piper of Crossbarry, and he was the piper, even though he hadn't a gun at Crossbarry. Tom Kelleher always maintained that Flor Begley was worth about 20 men at Crossbarry, because when he started the pipes, when he started playing the pipes, the war tunes on the pipes, the British got a bit rattled, because they were accustomed. Music could be played only when there was a very large, when they were facing a very large contingent. So they must have thought that there were hundreds of volunteers against them at Crossbarry, and that rattled them. They got badly rattled when they heard the music. You also had Paddy O'Leary. He was in Upton. He went to Crossbarry. Neelis Begley was also there. Dindoolan was also there. There were 5 of them at least in Upton, and the ones I named who took part in Crossbarry.
Yeah, and if I can go to
there was a number.
If I can go to
a number in supporting roles.
Yeah,
yes.
If I can go back, Sean, if I can cut across it there now, if I can go to Mort there now, Mort, your aunt was coming on at Crossbarry, was she?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. At my aunt Catty, for instance, the night before Upton, she had watched their guns. They were staying here in this place, in our place in Raheen, before Upton, but then before Crossbarry, she carried information to Tom Barry the night before Crossbarry, And there's a graphic description in Mead Ryan's book about how the Common Lamond girls were carrying information in relays and so on. But in particular, my aunt certainly carried information to Tom Barry, the latest, I suppose, intelligence or information on the progress of the British the night before Crossbarry.
Yeah, and if I can go back to Bat Falvey, who was killed at Upton, his brother Sean. I mean, there's a lot of families. There's be quite a number of families or members of families involved. His brother was fought at Kinmichael, Sean Falvey.
That's right.
So it's sad how his brother Bat was killed. And then you have a story about Sean Whelan as well. Sean O'Phelan. He was born in Liverpool. You have a bit of a story about him, Mort. You have a bit of a story about Sean O'Phelan, Sean Whelan, who was killed.
Sean Phelan was from Liverpool. He was a teacher from Liverpool of Irish parents. Now, John Desmond, the historian, Bandon, discovered that he was baptized John Whelan. But of course, the Irish for both is the same, it's O'Phelan. But anyway, how he got to Upton was by chance, well, a bad chance as it happened. There was a lady in Cork by the name of Josephine Marchmont, who was married to an English officer who was killed in the World War I. And they had 2 children. And he was being buried in Wales, and she went over for the funeral with the 2 children. And after the funeral, she stayed for a brief period with his parents. And when she was coming back, they said they would keep one of the children. She presumed that would be for a small period. But when she got back, to her horror, after time, she found that they had no intention of releasing her other child to her. And she became frantic. And one day she tried law and failed. Yeah, my brother says, she tried law and that didn't work. One day she went into the Holy Trinity Church in Cork, and the priest on duty, again, there was a stroke of luck in it for her, was the Father O'Connor, who was sympathetic to the volunteers. In fact, his brother was an officer in the volunteer. And she told him her sad story. And he said that he would make contact with an officer of the 1st Cork Brigade. And the man he made contact with was the intelligence officer, Florrie O'Donoghue. And he arranged a meeting, and between Josephine Marchmont, whose maiden name was McCoy, and she was originally from Limerick, and her father was also a senior RIC officer. When Florrie O'Donoghue met her, the agreement was that if she happened, because of her husband's position as an officer in the British Army, and her father's high rank in the RSC, she had a key position in Victoria Barracks, which is now Collins Barracks, and she could see all the incoming and outgoing correspondence in Victoria Barracks. So the agreement was that if she provided good information to the volunteers for a number of months, that they in turn would retrieve her child for her. Now, she did give this very correct, authentic information. And in time, Florrie O'Donoghue went over to Liverpool, and then he had to get about 4 people over there that were sympathetic to the Irish cause. One of them happened to be Sean Phelan, and they went down to Wales. They actually retrieved the child, came back to Liverpool, and Sean Phelan accompanied Florrie O'Donoghue back to Cork. The other 3 remained in Liverpool. Yeah. And when he came to Cork, he decided to stay and join the volunteers, and that's how he happened to be in Upton.
You're the very brave man, so.
And just as a matter of interest, Upton was his first engagement. There's just one little incident I'd like to mention. There was a lady on board the train at Upton. She had a basket of eggs, and she had a lot of people on the train trying to find the basket of eggs. Now, the story there is the woman didn't seem to realize she was worried about the basket of eggs. What about herself and the other people on board? It was more in danger than the eggs being broken.
Yeah.
That's right. She was a lucky woman if it were only the eggs were missing.
Well, it's funny in some ways, but it's very serious. There was more danger than the basket, the eggs being broken.
Yeah, everybody has their own problem when it comes down to it.
Yeah. And the O'Donnells of Castleac were concerned because you know, they were good merchants and they had a lot of goods at Upton, and all their, we say, sacks of grain was destroyed, like, you know.
Well, they were afraid. The sacks of grain that were seen at Upton, and some of them were used as barricades by the volunteers. The Keys MacDonalds were afraid that because their names were on it, they would be raided again by the British, and they were being raided morning, noon and night by the British anyway, because they were supporting the volunteers. So this worried them as well. It just goes to show how the one action can affect different people in different ways.
And
it actually took place on a Tuesday.
Were the sacks of grain on the train, or were they on the store in the stores in Upton?
They were in the goods.
They were in the goods store.
Goods store. And some of those were probably brought out and used by volunteers as sort of cover for
shields and
yeah.
There were a couple of priests. There were a couple of priests as well, including some from Upton, from the monastery.
That's right. They came down from St. Patrick's.
They came to assist the wounded. And
yeah. I might Rocky may go di Martinish, but inish dum fi Uncle Pat Mort. Agus a clown, agus caden winter be via college le cognition clown, agus cadella via schulige Kevin Rev Shagover no.
Vi Shagover Hollis, vi had a gober Hollis Sassana on Trasan. Vi Rivray, ak Hanig Shawalla contrad Erson the Heron, nor vi cognition Shul. Vi post mahige, mar Cadahora Mish Inish Sais Rod Cosula physiotherapist, Howl Unchin London, Agus Hanig Shawalla, Contridian of her son the Heron. Vi on Clown Galeron, saw Winter Hulvan, saw vi had the Anna Guinea-Fox, so Rod Galer, and Nos Winter Kaliker, Winter Jan, Agus Galorella, Temple the Height. Vi Uncle Sean, vi Uncle Pat in Ifigok, so Colin Grodna Boundon, Bandon Battalion, Agus vi mar Ifigok Ingeltorukta, Agus Unchin, vi no Hingeltore, Goberon, so Dorira, Agus vi Uncle John on Guinea for Conchin Marisha Gama, Le Corsi McNula, Agus Marshinde. Vi should go there, Agus vi gna ogluk by Maher, Agus Chéad safe house and so doesn't hopefully give you a tap, Agus gemacht, Agus is many community Chéad and so vi on a winter Agus Comóradh Shin, Chéad a lawn arm, a lawn rifle, Agus lawn cogwig on Verum, Agus is stolen Brev King Eram winter Nia no Neville in Ackling and so we
Frank Neville
we in a if we got so regard so Chéad regard so three of regard with Comóradh Dorche got a source let truck a hand rifle on so Valley Farnshaw in over one temple Caro no nesmo na son den a rifle golera vi in her corky but vi have made it we on a critical and so Agus vi mind 19 Catty and Shin in a captain or coming the man on Brian Shaw Julish.
Vi encounter Shin on a Guinea-Fox so vi land in Partox a counter Shin.
Bhí go leor daoine gníomh timpeall an counter seo. Agus dúirt stolam go nuairt the MDC in a leabhar go raibh go leor clán agus luigse cúpla king Fords, Ballymurphy, O'Mahony's, Belrose, Delaney's, Belrose, Winter Hulvan and so Neville's, Argorsa, Bale Dorish, Drew's, August Kelleher's, Gnocca Frecon, Crowhill, Winter, Tom Kelleher, and good have on a winter shoot go later leisure rod sa team sa course nutshot.
Chun scorib sé Comóradh son sa counter sin an raibh winter coalition na finini revision no
Con bheith macánta ní lisagam ach is minic nuair a bhíoh tradiisiún na bhíníní ann go raibh túncaige na hóglaigh ina íag sin ach níl an tólas san a gom. Bhí Dick Barrett ag fannacht le muintir bhúna mar bhí sé ina bhúntóir is go náisiúnta an grán bhí sé mar phríomhí don sin.
Ach le bhí an counter eile láidir freisin Ballinús agus Kilbretáin bhí sé an láidir freisin.
An a láidir na háitina sin.
Belnadí agus háitina mar sin. Dúir túlam Seán go raibh sé gur cá anna crua a bhí ann in Upton gur bhí sé anna dachar ar fad ar na hóglaigh agus fuair siad anna taí as an Luíochán sin cé gur fuair trúr bas ag an Luíochán trúr óglaigh a go éana trochar áú agus ar na daoine sibhiúilte go fuair bas freisin ach bhí sé anna crua dúirt go minic go raibh sé anna crua.
Bhí muíon agus misnach ag teáil agus a compánig brú a Chéad ar na Sasannig agus iad sin Upton.
Agus an de ahar féin cai gur fear anna láidir mar thug sé Charlie Cáilíochán a hiile Charlie Hurley ar a grim ar feadh cúpla míle.
Bhí sé ógan Tom sin agus bhí sé páirteach san Valley Rovers san Imant agus rudí mar sin agus bhí sé gobar ar an ferm nuair bhí sé óg so
bhí a dreithir Jack an raibh dreithir Jack aige?
Bhí Jack níos sin in á Tom den de bhíon níos sin is Stoker agus bhí sé in Bhliain community áúil in na Seán. None of an election in the August. Game.
Just another question I'll put to you, Sean. Ask Berlin now. Charlie Hurley was very well. Sure, all the volunteers were upset. It weighed heavily on them. Upton Ambush on account of losing 3 volunteers, and also the civilians who were killed. 6 civilians lost their lives there, and I believe a number of British soldiers didn't get off lightly either. I think there were 6 of them at least wounded at Upton. So it wasn't all one-way traffic either. But the volunteers were in a difficult situation because they had no probably definite targets when they were mixed through the people, mixed or dispersed in the carriages. So it weighed heavily on Charlie Hurley shoulders and Tom Keller too, I'm sure.
Yeah, a peculiar thing about Charlie Hurley was that he had a premonition that he would be killed, and he often said that. And he said that when I am killed, when I am shot, I will be alone, and that's the way it happened. He had that premonition. Yes, Upton weighed fairly heavily on him, even though he couldn't be held responsible because he didn't know what was happening and all that. But he had that premonition about that he would. And as a matter of interest, he shouldn't have been at Fords because he was advised. I think Sean Buckley stayed at O'Connell's, I think, and he was advised not to stay there, that it was too dangerous. and he was very loyal to the Fords, and he said, well, he would stay, and he did. But there was also somebody gave information away, wasn't there? I'm not going to mention any names. I'm not going to mention any names, but there was an individual who gave information. He may not have given the exact location, the exact house, but he gave the area that this man had been captured by the British, and he gave them information, because that happened to a few. He gave them information.
The same man that gave away Upton.
Yes, yes. And then he was sent to England for a while. And something happened in England. My aunt, Moll, who worked in Selfridges, she died in 1932. And Tom Kelleher went across. This is a little story on it. He went across to England to bring her remains back, I suppose, by the old Kenmare by boat. There weren't planes bringing back people then. I think she went in 1932. So she was brought back by, but she got pneumonia or something like that, and all that. But when they were going on a certain street in England, and whoever he was with said to him, there was a man passed there, he said, and he looked at you. He looked at you and he moved on. But he said, if you come to a certain location now, he'll pass again, some doorway or something like that. So Tom Kelleher went with him, and sure enough, this man passed. And
Tom Kelleher recognized
him, yes. But he thought, I think when he saw Tom Kelleher, he saw him. The man who had given him thought that Kelleher was sent to London to make an attack on him, which wasn't the case at all. But that happened. But eventually that man came back, and he lived.
He did, yeah.
There, didn't he?
He came back in the 1960s.
Yes, he died in the 1960s. But nobody ever interfered with him. So that's a little story from it as well. The other thing I would say, of course, is that you know, who are they? Who are the people who took part in the Upton Cead ambush? They were very ordinary people, for want of a better term. They were farmers' sons. They were people who worked for farmers and like that. Yeah. They worked in shops and or manual labor and that type of thing. They were very ordinary people. But when you stop and think of it, and I have stopped a few times and thought of it, and I said to myself, they had tremendous courage and commitment. To take Tom Kelleher as an example, he was first of all recruited by a man called Bob Welsh. And Bob Welsh came to him and he said, we're going to have a campaign going in sometime in the not too distant future. He said, would you like to join? And Tom Kelleher said, yes, he would. So then he went away, and he went away and he came back 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, and he said, now, what are you thinking now? So Tom Kelleher said to him, yes. I said, I'm keen on joining. So that's how he came in first into it. Yeah. He also spent some time at Hyde's in Turin when he was Hyde's had the horses in Turin. Yeah. And Tim Hyde won
the Grand National, you know. Tim Hyde in later years, you know.
And of course, I went to school on the pony to the Groin. You remember probably me going.
Yeah, I remember that. In my time, Sean Kelleher was the only pupil that arrived on horseback.
On horseback, yeah. Well, it's peculiar. And all the time that I was in school, I never saw anybody riding a horse to school only myself. Only when my brother Cahill, when he started to go to drawing school, I took him in front of me and rather behind, because if I had him behind, he might fall off. So I had to hold on to him to keep him on board. And so that was interesting. On one occasion, though, I'm not supposed to be saying this now. On one occasion, on the way back, some of the youngsters said to me, boys and girls, could I jump a fence with the pony? I said I could. So, you know, we're on the way up to Kelly's Cross. There's a hill. So on the left-hand side, I got into the field on the left-hand side, but there was quite a drop from the field onto the road. Oh. So I brought the pony onto the edge of the fence, and she looked down, and there was quite a drop. So anyway, I pushed her on. Geez, the next thing that happened was the pony's hind hoof got caught on a stump of a tree, and I was thrown onto the road. I was blood in my hands, was blood in my knees. Yeah. Wear short pants at that time, no long pants then. So I arrived home, all blood, and I never tried that again.
A lot of the volunteers, I suppose, would be good horsemen, would they? Would they have travelled? Would they have used horses for carrying messages?
They would have used horses, and Tom Barry used a horse. Can I tell you a short story about that?
Did he ride a horse or just a horse and cart?
He rode a horse.
Yeah.
He rode a horse, no. Can I tell a short story about that? When he was approaching O'Malley's in Belrose, the headquarters of the brigade, he was held up and he was posing as a medical student. And he had some medical papers and all with him.
That's right.
They checked him out and they discovered, they let him go then. And I think they realized afterwards that they had let him go, but he arrived in Crowhill. And my grandmother, Mary McCarthy, he used to always call her Mary McCarthy. He never called her Mrs. Kelleher because Mary McCarthy was her maiden name. She was from Inishannon and she married John Keller from the Shore. So Mary McCarthy, my grandmother, came out and she gave him, put holy water on him, and she gave him milk or something as well, I think he said.
Yeah.
And she sprinkled most of a bottle of holy water over him and the horse as well. They saddled the horse, they put a saddle on the horse, and he rode away to the west, Barry did, on the horseback, away to the west. And my grandmother had put a lot of holy water on him, so that saved him.
Kept them safe and all.
But they were able to horses, because horses and also bicycles. Now, the bicycles were causing a problem. And on one occasion, here near Bandon, where we're now, Geoffrey Canty and Frank Hurley of Laura, they were asked to kind of sort out, to collect all the bicycles. The British, they were using bicycles to travel, and this was about him. And the British got wise to this, and the British decided that all the bicycles should be confiscated, so they wouldn't be able to use bicycles. And Geoffrey Canty had collected some bicycles and all that, and he was captured just near Baxter's Bridge to the west of Bandon, and he was killed. He was shot by them. Frank Hurley was captured at Laura. Frank Hurley, they had him captured, and he was watching his chance, and he decided to make a run for it. He was involved in the bicycles as well. He decided to make a run for it, and he was shot dead. He didn't escape. He didn't get it. There was one man, though, I must tell you this, there was one man that did get away from Percival. His name was John Ryan. Now, John Ryan was a very young man. He was very, very athletic. He was about 19 years of age at the time. And he lived to be almost 100 years of age. And on one occasion, I got a phone call from a man called Paddy Cooney, not the former minister. This man was a journalist. He's based in London. And he asked me to know about Ryan. He wanted to interview Ryan. So I met up with him and we went to Upton House. Upton House was where the Paynes lived, and De Valera had dinner there one time. I think he was giving Carrigan Moss and some whatever. And when I went with Cooney to meet John Ryan had shot at Percival, but Percival was wearing a bulletproof vest, and he didn't kill him. But he was chased. They chased Ryan, but Ryan was very fast. He was very athletic, and he got away. He got away from them. But anyway, to make a long story short, the journalist wanted to interview Ryan. He knew Ryan was of significance. So he sat under a tree. It was the summertime, and he started to ask questions. And Ryan wouldn't respond. He wouldn't respond because he didn't know him. He was quite elderly at the time. He was in his late 90s. So after a while, Cooney looked at me, Paddy Cooney looked at me, and he said, you better talk to him, he said. So I went over and I spoke with Ryan, and I sat down near him. So I got the job of interviewing John Ryan rather than Cooney, the journalist. And he took notes on what was going on. He responded to me because he knew me, but he wouldn't respond to Ryan. He was suspicious. He wouldn't respond to Cooney. So I interviewed him under a tree in Upton House quite a number of years ago now, not a huge long time ago, but Ryan lived to be almost 100 years. John Ryan, he was the one man who shot at Percival. Percival was the head of the Essex Regiment based in Bandon and all that. And he was notorious. By the way, just talking about Percival, Tom Kelleher, my dad, once on one occasion was in Charlie O'Sullivan's of Raheen, your house, and he went to sleep there. And in the middle of the night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, he woke up and he said, "Where am I?" And he realized, oh God, I'm in Charlie Hurley's house. Charlie O'Sullivan's house, sorry, Charlie O'Sullivan's house. He said, "I'll have to get out of here because this is a dangerous place to be." So he dressed very quietly, stole down the stairs and got away. And he went along to, what was the name of that man? An old man.
O'Callaghan.
Callaghan in Connacht-Tree-Con, is it?
Yeah.
And
Connacht-Lee.
yeah, Connacht-Lee, sorry, Connacht-Lee.
Connacht-Lee.
What they used to do with old man Callaghan, get in, you know what they used to have to do? Throw pebbles up at the window, any hour of the night or day. So he threw pebbles up at the window and O'Callaghan left them in, he'd cook for them and all that. But that's not the end of the story.
Yeah.
About 8 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the morning, who arrived at O'Sullivan's, but Percival, with some of his men. And he was met by your dad, and he said, "Have you anyone in the house?" And I was, your dad said no. And then he went upstairs. And Charlie, this is what I've been told, Charlie O'Sullivan couldn't understand what was happening because he thought there'd be eruptions upstairs, that there'd be shooting and everything.
Yeah.
Because Tom Keller is up there. He's asleep up there. They'll surely find him. And he thought, your man came down the stairs and he, in departing from the house, he said, "I haven't found anybody." But I said, I know you keep people, he said, "but I'll be back." That's what he said to Charlie, your dad. "I will be back," he said. In the meantime, he rushed up. Your dad rushed up and he was checking under beds and everything. And he said, he must be inside in some cupboard or somewhere. He must be suffocating. Or has he gone into an attic or somewhere? He couldn't understand how Kelleher wasn't up in the bed. He had to get away very quiet. So that's an interesting story.
Very interesting, Sean.
Another story from that is that on one occasion they were playing cards in your house in Raheen. And Sean Hales was there and many others. And after a while, they realized, well, this is not the best place to be. So they left, and they were only just out of the yard, or just slightly beyond the yard, when they heard voices, and they stopped and they listened, and they recognized the British voices. A number of British soldiers came along and searched O'Sullivan's house. Now that was a very near one. That was a very tight one. They could have.
Just going back to.
Do you want to hear a story about? Do you want to hear a story about how some of the volunteers, Flor Begley and Liam Beasy and company, escaped from a house in Bandon? Do you want to hear that?
Yeah.
Yes, to be
Very short.
Nice to hear that, Chair. Yeah.
The British set up blocks in what was known as the house. It's the street where the hotel is now.
Right.
They started.
Shannon Street.
Yeah, Shannon Street. They started at each end. But they came to this house, which is a Protestant house. It was Fitzsimon's, I think. Fitzsimon's.
Oh, Fitzsimon's, yeah.
Fitzsimon's, and it was a shop and a pub. But some of the, as you know, some of the establishments at that time were shops and pubs. You remember them?
That's right. Yeah.
You'd have a pub and a shop in the one room. The shop was towards the front, and the pub was towards the back. And at the back of the little pub, there was a bench seat, a small seat. A bench seat would hold 2 people. And there was a local lady. She was Miss Gilman. She used to sit there. She used to have a little toddy. She'd have a little drop of the ishkibaha, and she'd sit there. So she was sitting there, and on this occasion at the back, and this was Fitzsimon's shop and pub. And upstairs, in one of the rooms upstairs, you have Flor Begley, Liam Beasy, and some others, and they used to use it for holding meetings. They were there on this occasion. When the British officer and his men arrived in, they said, he said to them, "Now, lads, we're going to search this house now from top to bottom." And Miss Gilman was sitting at the back, and he was about to make a start with the search, and she stood up from the seat like this. She stood up from the seat and she said, God save the king.
Good.
God save the king. The man in charge of the British stopped up. He was in full flow, describing them at the full flow. He looked at the lady. He said, "Oh, yes, madam." And he kind of saluted her. And then he said, he looked at his men then, and he said, "Well, men," he said, "lads," he said, "this is a loyal house. There's no need to search this house." And off they went. Now, that was a near one, because if they had gone up the stairs, Begley, DC, so many more were up there, what would have happened? Anybody's guess? Would it be like Charlie Hurley? Or
So, Miss Gilman saved the day, like.
Miss Gilman saved the day.
That was a great story, Sean.
Yeah. God save the king.
God save the king. Just going back to the Sean mentioned body armor there. No, Mort, I'd say were many of them officers. I'd say the British officers would have been wearing it at Upton probably, and at Crossbarry after.
I would think so, Donica. Yes.
Officers.
I take it for granted that the British knew beforehand that what was being contemplated in Upton, certainly the Essex Regiment, the crowd that came, the extra soldiers that came from Kinsale. And I would be very surprised if they weren't wearing body armor. They had body armor. In fact, they had two kinds of body armor available to them when they were in Ireland. And if they knew they were going to action, I'm sure they would be wearing it. So that would explain why there weren't. I don't think there were any British deaths at Upton, for instance, even though there was close and hand-to-hand fighting, as Sean Keller said rightly there earlier on. And, you know, person firing from one side of one side of a wall at people over at the other side. You'd expect there'd be British casualties and deaths, but I don't think there were. And I think there must have been wearing body armor on this occasion. And it would also strengthen my belief that they knew beforehand, some of them at least, Essex would have known beforehand, I'd say, what was contemplated at Upton.
Tom Carter, Mark. Tom Carter.
So we'll have to move on there. So we'll have to kind of bring it to a close now shortly. Just the three volunteers, which is unusual as well, they're buried in St. Finbar's Cemetery in Cork.
Yeah.
St. Finbar's, and the monument, as far as I know, that was erected in Upton in 1968. Would that be correct, or
67, I think.
67, yeah. And
67, yes.
I can remember when I first got involved in the Kilmichael Crossbarry Commemoration Committee that prior to on the morning of the Crossbarry commemoration, that there was always a commemoration at Upton, but that ended back a number of years. So Sean, you might just tell me how many years back was that?
We used to have a commemoration. Kitty O'Leary, Kitty McCarthy used to organise it as well. We'd have a mass in Upton beforehand, and then we would go down to the monument in Upton, and we'd have a reed-laying ceremony and all that. One of the speakers on one occasion was Albert Reynolds, the former Taoiseach.
Crossbarry, yeah.
Not all the speakers would come to Upton, but he attended the mass, and then he came down to the monument, and I said a few words on that. One of the things I said was that, addressing Mr. Reynolds, I said, I know that our former Taoiseach, Albert Reynolds, is here with us today, and he's very welcome. I said, former Taoiseach, I'm sure when you were Taoiseach, you'd have preferred being Taoiseach of a 32-county Ireland rather than a 26-county Ireland. So he's kind of smiled at that. He didn't make any comment other than that.
Yeah, just as I said there,
we'd move on then later to. But we always included Upton with Crossbarry, and it took place a month before it.
I mentioned at the start of our talk, Sean and Morton Mihal, that February was a particularly dark period for the 3rd Brigade, West Cork Brigade, where they lost 11 volunteers in the space of 12 days.
12 days.
We just remembered them tonight now, because due to the the COVID-19 or virus.
Yes, I actually have here.
On the 4th of February, you had volunteer Patrick Crowley Kilbrittain. He was killed by the Essex Regiment. He was a very promising volunteer. I think he was in a safe house or in a jugo because he had appendix, I think. And there was a lovely little memory.
He was to be promoted.
Yeah,
he was due to be promoted.
On the 7th of March or February, then you had Patrick O'Driscoll, Mona Haskabreen. He was killed in an accidental shooting. And
you know the story about him, don't you? He was O'Driscoll was going to handing over. There was a change of the guard, if you like, and the chap that was going to replace him, Tom Barry appeared on the scene then, and they were kind of changing. And Barry said, I think that Barry's presence as being the column commander upset this man that was there with O'Driscoll, and all of a sudden, this man he was a bit excited. His gun went off, and O'Driscoll dropped to the ground, and O'Driscoll was dead. He was shot accidentally. It was very sad.
Right, yeah. On the 14th of February, then you had the Coffey brothers of Bhliain, Inniskeen, Patrick and James Coffey. We'd like to remember them as well. They were taken from their beds by the Essex Regiment in the morning, early in the morning, and their Essex were led by masked local loyalists, an anti-Sinn Féin, Sinn Féin group, and they were executed.
There was a lady that led them to the house.
Yeah, they were executed at the top of a field, the two Coffey brothers. So, and then on the 15th, the reason we're here tonight is the Upton Ambush. You had Pat O'Sullivan, Bat Falvey and Sean O'Phelan were killed and very seriously wounded. Then were Dan O'Mahony, he died shortly afterwards, and a number of years afterwards.
And just
as a matter of interest, a member of the O'Mahony family has died, and his funeral is tomorrow, and that's Noel O'Mahony. So I'd like to take this opportunity to sympathise with the family. There's only two left now, Eileen and Seamus. Noel O'Mahony has died, and he was one of the famous family from Belrose Upton.
And of course, Charlie Hurley.
They went to school with him.
Yeah, Charlie Hurley was seriously wounded that day, and Tom Keller took him to safety. But I suppose Crossbarry wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened, I suppose, only for Upton, and even though there was informers kind of which led them into that area, Ballymurphy and where the IRA headquarters was.
But there's no doubt about it, Donica, that the experience that they obtained at Upton stood them at Crossbarry. It stood them at Crossbarry. Yeah. I have the names here of the people killed at Krishnalanna, if you want me to name them.
Oh, sorry, I didn't name them. Krishnalanna, then.
Yeah, Jeremiah, they were all local. They were all local. They were
they were all from Kilbrittain or Ballinadee. You had Con McCarthy, John McGrath, Timothy Conley, and Jeremiah O'Neill. So
Jeremiah O'Neill, Timothy Conley, Jack McGrath, and Con McCarthy, the four of those.
Yeah, and they were killed on the day after of Upton Ambush. So
just the day after, just the day after Crossbarry. The day after Upton. So 16th.
Crossbarry was badly. The Crossbarry ambush was badly, or battle, I suppose we should call it. The Crossbarry battle was badly needed. So following all of that, like, because I mean they had some big setbacks, reverses. I suppose the 3rd Brigade following all those, losing all those valuable volunteers during that period to the dark period. Tom Barry wrote in his book, he had chapters, especially on that the 12
dark days.
12 dark days, like so. But I mean, they lost men at Crossbarry as well, like. But I suppose they inflicted heavy casualties on the British, like so. So I suppose
the same day as Upton, there was 5 lost in Morden Abbey, you know.
Yeah.
And the following Sunday there was 12 lost in Clonmalt.
Yes. Yeah. And just a matter of interest, both of those, I believe, were mentioned on C1OC radio today, this very day. They were both mentioned today, Clonmalt and Morden Abbey, this very day, the 12th of February, 2021. Reference to them, and it was only appropriate that they would be mentioned. Yes.
So we remember all those people because I suppose Clonmalt was the single biggest loss of life during the War of Independence. And as well as that, there was 4 executed afterwards, following Clonmelt, which brought it to 16. So it was a fairly significant loss of lieutenants.
Can I make one comment?
Yeah. Yeah, Sean.
Can I make one comment on the other? Sometimes the question is asked, how did an army feel like, how did ordinary men supported by Manon Heron, by the women, how did they succeed in being so successful against British forces in Ireland, far outnumbered, with far more training, far more equipment, far more resources behind them? How did they succeed? And I think the short answer is that they had a majority of the people behind them. Many people got out of their beds and gave them their beds when they were out cold and hungry. I mentioned earlier about the O'Callaghan man in Connacht. The O'Callaghan man would get out of his bed, no matter what hour of the day or night, and he'd start cooking for them when they'd arrived there at all hours of the night. He'd start cooking for them.
So, Kun Creek a correlation now. Sean will sing the Upton Ambush for us, but before that, I'd like to say Gura Milama Egan Truraviv as Scale Luíochán Upton ancient doing agus Coramak Crave Squeal Goody on down illig agus I mean we could keep talking forever about Upton and Prosperity and everything like, but I think it's very important that we mark this occasion now, especially in the circumstances where we can't have a full-scale commemoration. I know people will be doing their own individual things, but by me the caint Arish ta Crossavary le Conov Day Big Rodagan or Shulfi Crossavary on Ka is more a Muffy and Tua. A Rick is the biggest land battle during the War of Independence, as far as I know. And that's not, I'm not talking about the Civil War now, which was another different story altogether, but that was the biggest engagement, and there was significant losses inflicted on, casualties inflicted on the British. So, Gurav Mina Margav Arish, and we'll creek Nomin in Ishla Upton Ambush or Sean O'Callaghan.
On Wallet Hinham Denica? Well, an accordion.
Well, Daring May Europe that big shade docker size on Bertiging will be probably out. I'll try. Will I give a note? Will I give a note, Sean?
Okay.
I'll give a note if I can. I'll play it low now because I don't want to cut a pressure.
Okay, sorry, second.
Right.
Start again. Are filled with sorrow and with sadness. Many hearts are filled with anguish and with pain. Our old Ireland now she hangs her head in mourning for the men who fell at Upton for she failed. There's a moonshine tonight along the valley, where those men who fought for freedom now are laid. May they rest in peace, those men who died for Ireland, and who fell at Upton Ambush for she failed. Some were thinking of their mothers, wives, and sweethearts. More were thinking of their dear old Irish homes. Do they think of when they drilled along the valley, or when they marched on from the hillside to the road? There's a moonshine tonight along the valley, where those men who fought for freedom now are laid. May they rest in peace, those men who died for Ireland, and to fell at Upton Ambush in vain. The morning cry rang out big, and gallantly they fixed them for the fray. And manfully they fought and died for Ireland. Around the lonely woods and up the north. There's a moonshine tonight along the valley, where those men who fought for freedom now live. May they rest in peace, those men who died for Ireland, and who fell at Upton Ambush or Sinn Féin. Some are sleeping in their graves near the city, more are sleeping beneath their own parish grave. But their voices cry loud, may God save Ireland, and the men that of the Lord. There's a moonshine tonight along the valley, where those men who fought for freedom now are dead. May they rest in peace, those men who died for Ireland, and who fell at Upton Ambush or Sinn Féin.
Bula bus Sean, Anava. Gura míle mar bid go léir.
Ní raibh sé
Dígad ó that.
buna